Welcome to the debate. When you watch a grandmaster play a game of chess, there is this powerful, almost magnetic temptation to believe they are, well, simply calculating algorithms. You memorize the opening lines, you follow the grid, you consult your internal logic tree, and you just execute the sequence. It is a wonderfully closed system.
Yeah, it feels incredibly secure. And I mean, humans inherently crave that security, right? We want to believe there is a definitive, mathematically correct move for every possible situation you might ever face in life.
Right, but a negotiation table is not a chessboard. The moment you sit down across from a living, breathing human being whose goals are directly opposed to yours, that neat, closed system logic model just shatters.
Oh, absolutely.
You are suddenly operating in an interaction landscape that is completely volatile.
It is the absolute definition of an open, unpredictable environment. The second you introduce human psychology, ego, and, fatigue into the equation, the clean lines of a chessboard evaporate almost immediately.
And that fundamental tension brings us directly to the core of our discussion today. We are examining a highly provocative source text titled Beyond Books and Methods, which tackles the fundamental nature of human negotiation.
Right, and the author presents a pretty stark thesis here, which is that negotiation is inherently a fluid art form, not a rigid method-driven process.
Exactly. So the core question we have to grapple with is this. Does relying on textbooks and methodologies blind a negotiator to the realities of the exchange? Or is abandoning those structured methods a dangerous misinterpretation of how complex agreements are actually reached?
It is a really critical question because it dictates exactly how professionals prepare for these high-stakes interactions.
For my part, I argue in favor of the text premise, asserting that rigid methods and checklists stifle the intuition and real-time adaptation that are absolutely necessary for successful negotiation.
And I take the opposing view, arguing that the text presents a dangerous false dichotomy and that discarding the books and the methods undermines the very foundation that allows a negotiator to safely adapt in the first place.
All right, so let's lay out our positions clearly before we really tear into the mechanics of this. When I read Beyond Books and Methods, what really resonates with me is how accurately the text diagnoses the core engine of negotiation. It explicitly defines it as being about movement, adaptation, and intuition.
Right, which sounds great on paper.
But it's true in practice too. The text offers this profound warning to practitioners. It says that trying to freeze a living interaction into a rigid method shifts your focus onto your internal checklists rather than active attentiveness to your counterpart. So my stance is simple. Negotiation is a living interaction.
Okay, go on.
Well, clinging to textbook recipes guarantees you will miss the subtle real-time signals that actually dictate the success or failure of the exchange. You essentially stop observing the reality of the room because you are too busy observing your own methodology.
I just fundamentally challenge the text's opening command to, forget the books and the methods. While the text is absolutely right to value spotting openings and seizing opportunities, and no one is disputing that adaptability is a critical skill here, it wrongly assumes that methodology actively prevents this kind of awareness.
Which it often does.
I disagree. My stance is that the author heavily romanticizes intuition. The true ability to pivot, to read subtle signals without being completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data in a high-stakes room relies entirely on having a deeply internalized methodological framework to fall back on. Without that framework, what feels like brilliant intuition is usually just reactive panic disguised as inspiration.
I mean, we really need to look at the cognitive economics of this, because that is where the text firmly plants its flag. The text makes a very specific claim, which is that if a negotiator spends too much energy applying a technique learned from a book, they might miss the essential elements.
Right, but what constitutes, too much energy?
Well, let's break down the mechanism of why that happens. In cognitive psychology, we talk about bandwidth. Human working memory is strictly limited. It can only hold a few chunks of information at any given time.
Sure, that is a basic psychological principle.
Right, so if you enter a negotiation and your internal monologue is running a checklist like, did I establish rapport? Did I anchor the first offer? Am I using calibrated open-ended questions? Your processing power is directed entirely inward. You are consuming your own bandwidth.
You are describing a novice clumsily applying a tool they just bought, not an inherent flaw in the tool itself.
I have to stop you there, because the data really doesn't support that distinction. Even highly experienced practitioners fall into this trap when they overly rely on formal structures. Let's look at a concrete example. Think of a classically trained musician sitting in with a jazz band for the first time.
Okay, the jazz analogy.
If that musician is entirely focused on reading the complex sheet music, which represents your method, your checklist, they cannot genuinely hear the other musicians. If the drummer subtly rushes the tempo or the bassist changes the groove, the sheet music reader misses it entirely because their eyes are glued to the predetermined script.
Right. They aren't listening to the room.
Exactly. They effectively deafen themselves to the actual music happening. In a negotiation, the essential elements the text refers to are microexpressions, a slight vocal fry on a specific word, a half-second hesitation before answering a question about price. You cannot physically perceive those microsignals if your conscious brain is busy calculating step 4 of your textbook strategy.
The musician analogy is excellent, but you have the psychological mechanism entirely backwards here.
How so?
Well, I reject the premise that methods inherently demand too much energy. Cognitive science shows us the exact opposite mechanism is at play. Methods actually free up cognitive load. Let's stay with the jazz musician. The reason a master jazz musician can improvise, the reason they actually can hear the drummer rushing the tempo, is because the scales, the chord progressions, and the time signatures are so deeply ingrained as methodology that they require zero conscious energy to execute.
Right, but
Let me just finish this thought. It operates entirely on muscle memory. Having a method means you don't have to think about the structure of the conversation. That framework gives you the cognitive breathing room to dedicate 100% of your attention to those hesitations and microexpressions you just mentioned.
But the text is specifically warning against applying a technique learned from a book. It implies a conscious, rigid application that blocks perception.
Right. But the text tells us to forget the books and the methods entirely. If you don't have a structured method for uncovering interests or generating options, what happens to your brain?
You adapt.
No, all of your cognitive energy is spent trying to invent a structure in real time. You are trying to invent a new language while simultaneously trying to translate it. If you're constantly wondering what to ask next or how to respond to a demand without giving away your bottom line, your bandwidth is completely consumed by managing your own chaos. The framework doesn't blind you. It buys you the bandwidth to see.
But this cognitive overload isn't just a self-inflicted internal problem. It becomes a massive vulnerability the second you sit across from someone who actively weaponizes chaos. And this brings us directly to a crucial warning in the source text.
Are we talking about external pressures now?
Yes, moving outward from internal bandwidth to external pressure. The text highlights the extreme danger of encountering an opponent who doesn't follow any method and plays outside the box.
Ah, yes, the unorthodox counterpart.
Exactly. The text argues that a textbook-reliant negotiator will find themselves completely paralyzed against this kind of opponent. And mechanically, this makes perfect sense. If you're listening to this, you've almost certainly been in a room where someone just throws the script out the window.
Sure, we all have.
Imagine you're negotiating a massive, complex software merger. You walk into the room with your valuation spreadsheets, your logical sequence of concessions, and your rational methodology. And the counterpart walks in, ignores the numbers entirely, throws a folder on the table, and demands your CEO's resignation as a starting point before they will even discuss the software.
The classic power play.
Right, and your checklist is completely useless there. Your method dictates that you rationally trade concessions to find mutual value, but they are refusing to behave rationally. They are using positional leverage, just relying on sheer aggressive power and size to force a yes and pure brinksmanship.
I mean, they are threatening mutually assured destruction to see if you blink.
Exactly, because the method-driven negotiator system cannot process this level of absurdity. Their heuristic, their mental shortcut for solving complex problems, fails completely. They freeze. The intuition-driven negotiator isn't tied to a script, so they can adapt to the absurdity in real time.
I completely disagree with that reading. In fact, I consider this to be the source text's absolute weakest claim. An unpredictable, outside-the-box opponent who makes wild demands is precisely the scenario where you absolutely must rely on a solid methodology.
Wait, why? If their behavior intentionally breaks the rules of your methodology, how does clutching your rule book help you?
Because it acts as an anchor in a psychological storm. Let's look at the mechanics of unpredictability. When someone acts completely outside the box, like demanding a CEO's resignation out of nowhere, they aren't just being random. They are doing it deliberately to disorient you.
I agree. Chaos is a tactical weapon.
Right. It is designed to trigger your amygdala, to force an emotional fight or flight response, to make you abandon logic, and to sweep you into their current. If you go into that room only with your intuition and a desire to be a living art, as the text calls it, you are incredibly susceptible to being manipulated.
I don't think intuition means being easily manipulated.
But you will react to their chaos with your own unmoored emotional reactions. You will get defensive, you will counterattack, or you will concede out of pure shock.
And how exactly does a textbook stop the amygdala from firing?
By giving you a mechanical process to override the emotion. A strong methodology teaches you how to systematically de-escalate. When they scream a wild demand, your method tells you exactly what to do. Pause, ignore the aggressive tone, and ask a calibrated how question.
So, fighting fire with a script.
Well, for example, you might ask, how does replacing our CEO address the software integration timeline? That specific mechanism forces their brain to switch from emotional attack mode back into rational problem-solving mode. It gives you a tether to reality. It prevents the outside-the-box opponent from dragging you out of the box with them.
Okay, I understand the theory of the tether, but I have to challenge how that holds up in the actual room. How can a fixed method anchor you if the opponent simply refuses your invitation to be rational?
They don't usually refuse if the question is calibrated correctly.
But let's say you ask your calibrated how question, and they just laugh and say, I don't care how it works, do it, or we walk. If your anchor is returning to verifiable interests and the opponent refuses to articulate interests, your method isn't an anchor anymore. It is a dead weight.
I think that's a bit of an exaggeration.
No, you were standing there demanding a structural, polite conversation while they are burning the building down. This is exactly why the text emphasizes that real negotiation never unfolds like it does in textbooks. Textbooks always assume a baseline of shared, rational engagement. The art is knowing how to navigate when that baseline simply doesn't exist.
But if the building is burning down, the alternative the text suggests, pure intuition, is just as dangerous. Intuition in a burning building tells us to panic, to jump out a window, or to run blindly into the smoke.
That's not what intuition is.
That is what human instinct does under extreme, unstructured threat. Methodology is the fire escape plan. It might not be pretty and the walls might be melting, but following the established steps is statistically your best chance of survival.
But the text doesn't define intuition as panic, though. It defines it as the ability to spot openings and seize opportunities in real time. Which brings us to the ultimate goal highlighted by the source material, and that's the anatomy of the pivot.
Oh, absolutely. The pivot is central to the entire philosophy of the text.
The text states beautifully that negotiation happens in the moment, in the exchange, in the ability to pivot. And we need to look at what a pivot actually is, mechanically speaking. It is a spontaneous, complete reorganization of strategy based on a fleeting opening.
Okay, let's hear your example.
Let's put ourselves back in a room. You are talking to a vendor. The negotiation is entirely focused on wholesale pricing, and it is going nowhere. You are completely deadlocked. But for a split second, their tone shifts, maybe a slight drop in pitch, a tiny release of tension in their shoulders, when you casually mention delivery timelines.
A classic town.
Exactly. A textbook method didn't tell you they cared about timelines. Your framework was rigidly focused on calculating price points. But your intuition catches that physical shift. To pivot means to instantly abandon the price argument and fluidly dive into the logistics of delivery to see if there is leverage there.
Right, you pursue the new information.
It is a purely intuitive act. No textbook could have predicted that specific variable with that specific person on that specific Tuesday. That is why the text concludes that negotiation is a living art, not a fixed recipe. A recipe implies predetermined ingredients in a predetermined order. A living art allows for the spontaneous introduction of a completely new color on the canvas in real time.
I really don't disagree that a negotiation is highly dynamic, and spotting that tonal shift regarding the timeline is a masterful skill. But the text fundamentally misunderstands what actually enables a negotiator to execute that pivot effectively.
How so? By claiming it as an art form?
No, by claiming that the art exists in absolute opposition to the recipe. You cannot pivot effectively if you do not have a firm footing to pivot from.
What do you mean by firm footing?
Let's look at the biomechanics of a literal physical pivot in sports. A basketball player can only execute a lightning-fast pivot to change direction if one of their feet is firmly planted on the ground with absolute traction. If they try to execute that exact same pivot on a sheet of ice, they don't look like an artist, they just fall flat on their back. The methodology, the fixed recipe you are criticizing, is the traction.
But if your foot is bolted to the floor, which is what rigid methodology actually does to practitioners, you can't move at all. You are frozen.
Not true.
The text explicitly warns against trying to freeze it into a rigid method. You become so obsessed with your stance that you miss the pass entirely.
That assumes method is inherently rigid, which is a total misunderstanding of sophisticated methodology. A good method provides the baseline that allows the art to exist safely.
Go back to my vendor example then.
Gladly. When your intuition tells you to pivot away from price and toward timelines, how do you actually explore that new avenue without getting taken advantage of? You use methodological tools.
I suppose you would, yes.
You use open-ended probing, you use calibrated questions, you test hypotheses without making commitments. The intuition merely told you where to look. The method tells you how to look without accidentally giving away all your own leverage in the excitement of the discovery.
Okay, I see your point.
If you just intuitively blurt out, oh, you care about timelines, let's trade faster timelines for a massive price cut, you have just destroyed your own negotiating position. You showed your hand. The text treats method and art as mortal enemies, when in reality, the structure is the scaffolding that allows the artist to reach the ceiling to paint. You cannot paint the Sistine Chapel without scaffolding.
That is a striking image, but I would argue the text is specifically warning us about the negotiators who become so completely obsessed with building the perfect scaffolding that they forget to bring their paintbrushes.
Well, that's just poor practice.
But it happens. They sit in the room checking the structural integrity of their framework, making sure every bolt of their methodology is mathematically tight, while the fleeting opportunity to create a valuable agreement just passes them by. The text insists that negotiation is about movement.
Right.
And the danger of prioritizing the scaffolding over the art is that scaffolding, by its very nature, restricts free movement. It boxes you in.
I think that is a completely fair critique of poor practitioners who hide behind checklists because they are terrified of conflict. But it is a flawed critique of the concept of methodology itself. When the text explicitly commands us to forget the books and the methods, it is prescribing a cure that is far worse than the disease.
How is it worse to be adaptable?
Because, yes, don't be a robot. But discarding the accumulated, researched, and scientifically tested wisdom of how human beings resolve conflict under intense pressure, which is all a textbook really is, leaves you incredibly vulnerable. You are relying entirely on your own inherent talent and mood.
But human intuition is powerful.
And it varies wildly from day to day depending on your blood sugar, your fatigue, your personal biases, and your ego. Method protects you from the unreliability of your own mind.
Look, the human brain is a remarkable pattern recognition machine. Our intuition is often just our subconscious mind processing millions of environmental data points much faster than our conscious, methodical brain ever could.
Okay.
When the text advocates for negotiation as an art, it is simply asking us to trust that highly sophisticated subconscious processing over a clumsy, conscious checklist that slows us down.
Trusting your subconscious is fine, but verifying it with structure is essential. The intuition spots the anomaly in the room. The method unpacks it safely so it can actually be used to build a durable agreement.
Well, it seems we've reached a really fascinating distillation of our positions here. To summarize my perspective, I argue that true negotiation requires prioritizing active attentiveness and real-time intuition over rigid frameworks.
Right. The listener might be thinking, well, I use checklists and I do fine, but I believe the source text correctly identifies that relying heavily on these methods fundamentally blinds us to the living exchange. The ability to pivot, to handle deeply unorthodox opponents who weaponize chaos, and to capture the subtle, fleeting reality of the moment requires us to treat negotiation as an evolving art form, not a predetermined recipe. Using practitioners to entirely forget the books and methods.
Which you see as stripping away their tools.
Exactly. Doing so strips the negotiator of the exact cognitive and strategic tools required to process those subtle signals efficiently, to anchor themselves against chaotic emotional tactics, and to navigate unpredictable opponents. Intuition is undoubtedly vital, but without methodology providing a secure footing, A pivot is just a slip and fall.
I will say, we certainly agree on a foundational premise of the source text, that a negotiation is inherently a dynamic, volatile, living exchange. We both acknowledge that ultimate success requires constant movement, adaptation, and the ability to spot real-time openings that no textbook could ever predict.
Exactly right. Where we fundamentally diverge is on the practical function of formal methods in that deeply unpredictable environment. You view the method as a constraint that freezes the art and blinds the practitioner to reality.
I do.
And I view the method as the necessary scaffolding that organizes cognitive load, prevents emotional hijacking, and allows the art to be practiced effectively and safely.
It's a really profound tension. The balance between structure and intuition in high-stakes human interactions isn't just a question for boardrooms or diplomacy. It is fundamentally about how all of us process reality and handle conflict under intense pressure.
Absolutely.
The tension between method and art in Beyond Books and Methods provides incredibly rich material for further intellectual exploration. There is no simple binary here, and we certainly aren't going to declare a definitive winner or a definitively correct position today.
No, it really requires the listener to examine their own default behaviors. The next time you find yourself in a high-stakes disagreement and the pressure spikes, observe your own mind. Do you instinctively retreat to a safe, predetermined structure, or do you abandon the structure to trust your gut?
Precisely. And so the next time you find yourself staring down an opponent across the table and that neat, comfortable internal logic model suddenly shatters, ask yourself, are you going to frantically try to rebuild the framework, or are you going to step back, forget the sheet music, and finally listen to the reality of the room?